Hi, everyone. This is Heather Hodges. I'm an organizational psychologist. Welcome to my show. This is the place where we say I'm in to creativity, bold thinking, transformational growth, and meaningful conversations. Today, we're tackling a powerful and often overlooked topic, leadership injuries. What happens when the very people who are supposed to guide and support and inspire us wound us instead, whether intentional or not? In this episode, we will explore what leadership injuries are, how they affect individuals and teams, and most importantly, how can we recover from them? Whether you have personally experienced a leadership injury or you want to make sure that you're leading in a way that empowers rather than harms, this conversation is for you. My guest today is Dr. April Minatrea. She is a psychologist and expert in helping individuals and teams recover from leadership injuries. She's worked with leaders and organizations to heal workplace harm, rebuild trust, and create environments where people can thrive and do their very best work. Dr. April, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Great. When I first met you and I learned about your research and your work, and you told me that it was leadership injuries, I instantly knew what you were talking about because I've experienced it. So it didn't need a lot of explanation in my world. But for those who may not instantly recognize what we're talking about, what exactly is a leadership injury?
I would say almost everyone has been hurt by a leader. And those can be small things. It can be a comment that was made. It can be big things, like being, yelled at in front of the whole team. So it can be big or small. It can be the presence of something bad, like getting yelled at or a hurtful comment. It can also be the absence of something good. Like not having your work recognized or, no affirmation, no communication, or those bigger things like getting passed over for a promotion, and seeing it go to somebody else that you felt was undeserving when you thought you had earned it and maybe even thought you had it in the bag, so big or small, good or bad, there's a lot of different patterns that you see. There are things that might be a one-off incident. And then there are other things that, this is a chronic situation and it's a series of things. And those can work in tandem, right? Sometimes you have a lot of little things that lead to a big blow up. Sometimes you have one big thing that happens and then it just gets awkward. And there's just a lot of weirdness that happens and you just don't quite recover from that. So all of those different kinds of things can cause a leadership injury, which is the negative effect of an experience with authority. That could be with an individual. And oftentimes it is. Oftentimes it's very personal. A lot of times we see that with managers in particular. But it can be any leader in your life, right? So we go back as far as parents, teachers, coaches, pastors. There's a lot of different arenas. I tend to focus mostly on workplace. And I think it's also worth saying, while we may have that interaction either with an individual or an institution that causes leadership injury, there are some things that are more serious and cause longer lasting effects. And so I would deem those critical leadership injuries, right? The leadership injury might be, hey, my boss made this comment and it just, it really rocked me and it didn't feel good in the moment. When it's something that like, that was said to me and it got lodged in there and it impacted my confidence long term. It had long lasting effects, right? So when we're using the term critical here, we're not necessarily saying, they were critical of me, although that might be the case. It's really about a critical injury, right? We think of something that's more serious, something that has more long-lasting impairment. And there are certain things that we can carry with us for years because they either impact the way we see ourselves, they impact the way that we see authority, and they impact how we show up, maybe years later. Maybe not in every situation, but I think of it almost like a sports injury. A lot of people have an injury that from a long time ago, and it's like 95% of the time, I'm fine. I don't even think about it. But when I go to do this, I feel that. So I'd really try to, and I back off or I compensate or I don't put my full weight into that. because it hurts when I do. And I think we have the same things that happen in our relationships in the workplace where, hey, 95% of the time I'm fine, but I get in this one situation and, oh, that's uncomfortable. So I'm not leaning into that. I'm going to back off. And that's how it impacts us long term.
Wow. So that distinction with the critical injury, it, coming from a psychological perspective, it almost sounds like the chronic versus acute. Like, yeah, sometimes it can be long lasting versus acute. It was in the moment and yeah, it hurt, but I'm going to be through that by next week.
Right. And there are certain things that we kind of recover from, I think, more quickly than others. But a lot of it has to do with how did we interpret that event? And did we come to believe something about ourselves or about others? That now it's not just a thing that happened, but it's actually shaped our worldview or our self view. Those are the things that are more likely to have longer lasting impact.
Out of curiosity, how did you get into this topic in the first place?
It sort of found me.
Okay.
and it was kind of the synthesis of two different areas of interest. I spent most of my private practice years and my training before that working with combat veterans. And so that was kind of the idea of the leadership injury, the place that term came from, right? I've been dealing with invisible injuries in terms of post-traumatic stress, in terms of moral injury, right? That's a term that's common in the literature. And so I've been working with people who had invisible injuries for years, things that had happened in their past. It's still holding them back, but you could never tell by looking at them, right? And then that got combined. I was having conversations with my father, who is also a speaker in the leadership space, spent 30 years in a Fortune 100 environment. And so we were talking about leadership and those two ideas kind of collided. And I'm like, oh, there's a lot of people who have experienced these kinds of invisible injuries in the workplace, something to do with a leader in their life or something to do with authority that is still holding them back in one way or another, even if they don't necessarily realize it.
What are some of the ways that people can recognize a leadership injury in their life? How do you know?
I think part of what you do is look at what makes you uncomfortable. Right? Are there places where, you start to feel, fear, or you start to tense up when you find yourself in that situation? Or the other thing that you'll notice is where you have reactions that are disproportionate to what happened, right? And that's kind of a good psychological marker kind of across the board, and it applies to leadership injuries, right? So somebody said something to me that was a level 3, but my reaction to it was a level 10. That tells me that was not about that incident. There was probably something else deeper going on. And so if you start to notice those different types of reactions, and I would say they kind of fall into different categories, right? We have some people who will kind of bow up and so I'm going to take the bull by the horns. I'm going to get out in front of this. And they actually become aggressive, right? We have other people who, because of a past injury, they're trying to make up for what happened, right? And so the overcompensating and, trying to do everything to make sure that leader is happy with them and that everything's okay. It's a very fear-based kind of response. And then we also have people who then kind of shut down as well. And it's burnout. It's a feeling of kind of the learned helplessness of what I do is not going to make an impact here either, in any way, no matter what I do. So I'm just not going to try. And so I would say it maps on, in some ways you can think of it almost like a fight, flight, or freeze response, right? You get people who are like, oh, we're going, I'm loaded for bear and we're going to fight. You have other people who are running as fast as they can that are in flight mode. And you have the other people who shut down and are in freeze mode.
Yeah. So recognizing your reaction to something, not necessarily, oh, that triggered me. That's not what we're looking at. We're looking at what is my reaction to the incident. And so that self-awareness of the fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And is it disproportionate or not to
right. Is it disproportionate? And I think there's a piece of that. Then I think there's also noticing, where am I holding back? Where am I holding up? Where am I not showing up fully, and why not? Where am I not giving my best? Is that because of something that I believe about myself, that my best is not going to be good enough, so I'm pulling back? Is that something that I believe about my leader or my organization, that they're not going to appreciate it, or that they're not trustworthy, so I'm not going to give everything I have to this. Places like that, looking, where am I afraid and where am I holding back?
Gosh, and that is so much about psychological safety too, isn't it? Is it safe for me to give my best?
Right. Right. Is this going to be, is this going to be handled with care? Is it going to be treated with respect and with honor? Or am I, casting my proverbial pearls before piggies, where this is going to get trampled and I'm not, they're not going to do anything with it. So why would I even bother?
Wow. So when you think about, all the different organizations that you've worked with through the years in your practice, how have leadership injuries, how does it show up and impact both individuals and teams?
I would say some of the primary things for individuals, you'll see a confidence issue show up if the person has taken it personally. And you'll see a trust issue show up if it's something where it's impacted how they're seeing authority. Right. So if there's an issue with trust or an issue with confidence, those are two things that, that's happening. And then sometimes there are adaptations, right? So in my particular case, I decided I was just going to avoid leadership, which is rather ironic given where we are now. And this is, but you know how it is that your career will oftentimes, be the resolution of the things that you yourself have struggled with. And in my case, I just didn't want any part of leadership because I had some misperceptions about what that would entail, what that would involve. And so I held back. Right. And I designed my life to not have to go there. And I didn't realize, oh, wow, this is actually limiting my impact because I'm not trusting anyone else. And by the way, if I'm limiting my impact, I'm also limiting my income. Right. And so looking for the limitations will help you discover where you as an individual might be impacted. Organizations, you start looking, and a lot of times you'll start to see patterns. And I've seen multiple situations where one bad leader ran off a whole team and it impacted the entire organization, right? That multiple people said, I'm not putting up with this. I'm not doing this. And
I'm not going to work with them.
I'm not going to work with them. This is, and sometimes the team will hold together, but then one person is out. And when that happens, it's okay, nope, we all have permission to leave now. And so there's a lot that happens in terms of turnover and that process. Then you kind of play that out. Okay, well, so somebody just left. Well, the workload didn't go down. So now it's having to be distributed, right? The workload has increased to a team that is still stressed and dealing with a bad leader who's maybe not, helping them navigate that in the most efficient way. So now we're all more stressed and tensions are running higher. How do you think that's going to go, right? And so you play that out. And you're, maybe in recruitment, you're waiting for somebody else to come in and help rebalance that workload. So you've got lost productivity. You're going to increase your burnout. And then sometimes people end up, kind of bitter from those experiences. And so it can have a negative impact, right? That person, if they don't, and this is why I think the work that I'm doing is so important. If we don't address that, then you can carry it into the next organization that you work for. And I think that's one of the things when I talk to leaders, there are so many people who are like, I didn't cause this, but I can tell this person had something happen, right? I've inherited this issue. I have an injured player on my team, and it may not be their fault, and it might not be my fault, but we're seeing the effects of it. So we got to address it, right? From something that happened in the past.
That is so deep, so rich, so powerful. There's so many things there that I would love to unpack. But one of the things that kept coming to my mind is, as you were talking, is from an organizational perspective. When organizations don't notice what's happening, even though there's red flags left and right, that maybe there is this leader that is causing injuries all over the place. People are peeling off. It's a house of cards. Once one, as you described, once one person leaves, then the team just falls apart, and we've got low engagement, low morale, creativity suffers, productivity suffers, and then the organization has to compensate for that, and it's costly. Like the bottom line suffers, not only because of productivity, but once you start losing employees, it's very expensive to
Right.
replace
And
employees. Go ahead.
and your customers are going to feel that as well.
Exactly.
Right. It also gets multiplied in terms of just what's the story that people are telling about your organization, both from within inside and beyond. And I think it impacts customer loyalty, disengagement, just generally speaking. When people are disengaged, it impacts sales, and it also impacts customer loyalty because people are just they're like, I don't like the experience. There's an energy around it.
Yeah.
There's an energy around a healthy team. There's an energy around an unhealthy team.
Wow. And it's palpable. Like you can absolutely feel it. So from your perspective and your research and, all of your work, how do organizations prevent this from happening? And how do they identify those leaders that are causing the injuries in the first place?
I think communication is key, right? And if you're willing to open your eyes to it, it doesn't take long to figure out who that person is, right?
Yes.
And you may have to create, honestly, back to psychological safety, you may have to create a space that says, hey, we're giving an opportunity for people to have anonymous feedback. Sometimes it's those 360 reviews and things like that where, we're getting evaluation on our leaders, not just our employees. And so there's a dialogue going back and forth both ways. But I think so much of it has to do with culture and values. And I think in terms of prevention, one of the things that we can do is really envision, what does a healthy leader look like? What does a healthy team look like? What does a healthy culture look like? What is it that we're trying to do, and who is it that we're trying to become? And the work that I do with my father, he talks about the exponential mindset and shifting these limiting beliefs and perspectives. And it's essentially a leadership philosophy that says, I need to lead from identity and influence, not control, so that I can have scalable and sustainable growth, right? I'm going to have the greatest impact, and people are going to follow you for who you are and how you treat them, right? So when we're doing that, one of the things he and I talk about is creating an identity-based vision. Who do we want to be? Not just what do we want to do, not just what do we want to accomplish as a team or as an organization, but who do we want to be? How do we want people to describe us, right? And I think there's something about that, right? One of the things I encourage people to think about is what's the story you want to tell? And what's the story you want told about you? And so having those conversations, envisioning that, honoring people who are doing it well. And that's one of the things that I love about my work is not just talking about, oh, this is a toxic leader and these are the pitfalls to avoid, but to say, what does phenomenal leadership look like? Who are these folks that go above and beyond that we would run through walls for? And what is it about them that gives us that perspective? And I think the more that organizations can focus on what a good leader looks like and help give leaders the tools to develop into that, the less likely you're to see these kinds of injuries.
Yeah. So focusing on the positive end of this spectrum, like what does excellence look like? What are those behaviors, the values, the characteristics?
And it really, I think there's also a piece of having our priorities straight. When we take care of the people take care of business. If we focus on the bottom line to the detriment of the people, and they feel like a cog in a wheel, they feel like they're just being used, right? People feel that. And that's where you see low engagement. That's where you see leadership injuries happening, because people feel like they're being used. It feels transactional, right? And the fear is, but if we don't do that, then we're going to lose money. Well, actually, no, if you do that, you're probably going to lose money. You're going to lose your people, and then it's going to end up costing you more in the long run. And this is one of those things where it's kind of a slow is smooth, smooth is fast, right? If we'll put the investment into our people, if we'll take care of our people will take care of business. They're going to show up. They're going to give their best. We're going to have high engagement. That energy, not only is it going to make life a lot more fun, and this is a much better workplace to be in, but our absenteeism is going to go down. Our health costs and mental health costs are going to go down. Our retention is going to be higher. Our turnover is going to be down. We're not going to spend all of that time trying to replace people and train them and all of that lost productivity in the meantime. Let's make this a great place to work. And then, by the way, our customers are going to feel that and they're going to be on board as well. And so I think that's the other thing, is just having a culture that prioritizes people. It's a value.
I can't help but think about leadership styles and, some of the old leadership styles that were, popular 30, 40, 50 years ago, whether that was authoritarian or transactional, versus transformational, servant leadership, empowering leadership. Is there a style of leadership that might, unintentionally or, intentionally cause harm? And are there leadership styles that are less likely to cause harm?
I would say, I think authoritarian styles are more likely to cause harm, because I think they're more likely to be in that transactional kind of space where people are going to feel control and push back against that. I will also say there is a pitfall, especially when you talk about the unintentional harm. I think also being too passive can be a pitfall. And I've heard people talk about that. I'm thinking of one particular conversation where somebody shared how they had somebody else on their team that was doing some stuff that wasn't right. And the leader let it slide. And the leader didn't step in, and so I think we don't want somebody who's too passive. We don't want somebody who's aggressive, right? If we were to say, okay, the middle road is assertiveness, we want to be clear and be kind, and we want to be caring. We want to, speak the truth in love, and to do that in a way that says, hey, I'm calling you higher. I'm not just calling you out. I'm calling you higher because I believe in you and I believe that you're capable of more, right? And a leader who steps up and does that doesn't leave things go unchecked, right? But they're actually saying, hey, I need to bring out the best in my team. And when something's not aligned with that, then to say, like, let's be curious, not furious, right? Before I just come and rip you a new one, let me get curious, like, hey, what's going on there? And what was the thought process that led up to that? And what are the challenges or hindrances that are getting in the way of that? And I think so that kind of style fosters a healthier, more collaborative relationship. It creates that psychological safety that we've talked about. And there is accountability, because we're going to have a conversation, right? So it's not going to be like this lady who said, man, yeah, I was actually more hurt by the leader allowing this behavior from somebody else to go unchecked. It's almost like the playground rules of, like, is it the bully or is it the teacher who let the bully go and never stop them? There's some of that comes into play. But to say, like, oh, wait a minute, how can I step in, and how can I create space for people to step up into the best version of themselves?
Yeah. That continuum of leadership styles, like if you take authoritarian on one side, and then was it laissez-faire, the hands off. You mentioned it early on as in our conversation, and we didn't really unpack that a lot, but it's the sins of commission and omission. Sometimes what you don't do hurts as deeply as what you do. And from what I hear you saying, is it doesn't just hurt you; it could hurt the entire team if you don't take appropriate action.
Yes. And I think that's one of the things where we also have to know who's on our team, because the same leadership style could impact two different people differently. So, for example, let's take the hands-on leader, right? So to one person, that feels like micromanagement, and you're looking over my shoulder, and the message that I hear is that you don't trust me, and you don't think I'm good at my job, and so you have to do, all of this oversight to make sure you tell me what to do and you tell me how to do it, and then you check to make sure I did it. And that feels like, confining, right? By the way, you could say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to micromanage. I'm going to just trust you and empower you and let you run with it. Well, there are other folks who maybe because of something that's happened in their history, they're actually feeling insecure and they're like, man, I have no idea where I stand with this leader. I don't get any communication. I don't get any feedback. I just kind of feel like I'm given a task and then just thrown out there. I feel like I'm just kind of thrown to the wolves and I don't really know what I'm doing. I really could use somebody to come alongside me and check up on me and communicate and give me feedback. And there are some of us that at least in certain points in our career, or if we're in a new role and we don't understand it very well, a little bit of hand holding can go a long way to help that person feel supported. So the same leader could adopt the same style and two different people, one would feel micromanaged and the other would feel supported. And so part of it is knowing, just like you might not parent all of your children the same way.
Yeah.
Right? They have different personalities. They need different things from you. And sometimes that's their personality. Sometimes that's where they are in their development, right? So as a leader to say, okay, personality wise, who am I dealing with? But also in terms of where they are in their development, where they are in their career, where they are in this particular role, how familiar are they with the role that I've placed them in and the responsibilities they're being asked to carry out? And the best way to find that out is to ask them, right?
Get to know your team.
Let's have a conversation with somebody and say like, hey, what do you need from me? How are you experiencing this? And when I do this, what message do you hear from that? Is it I'm supported, or is it I don't trust you?
Yeah.
It's like, let's find out.
Oh, but that's a good reminder to all of us that, first of all, we need to know the people that we work with. So we need to have those, deep conversations to get to know each other and what each other needs and be a good situational leader, because the same action can be interpreted completely differently based on your needs, your tenure, your knowledge of a particular topic, your experience, and your personality.
Right. It is not one size fits all.
Thank you for that reminder. That's so good. Okay, so when we think about the healing process, how does this happen? How does someone begin to heal from a leadership injury?
The first step is to acknowledge it and to recognize what's happened. And over the last several years, I've taken the work that I've done with veterans and combat trauma. I used to use a protocol that was, 12 sessions long. And I took a look at that and kind of picked out some of the key elements and themes and put that together with, the wealth of clinical experience over, 25 years of studying psychology and working with people. And I've landed on kind of a 5-step healing process. So it's a little bit more condensed. But the first thing you have to do is recognize the impact of what's happened. And I think for a lot of people, that's never happened, right? There was that hurtful comment and they just said, hey, just, rub some dirt on it and drive on. And we are such a pull yourself up by your bootstraps society that happens, and so recognizing the impact, what did that cost you? How did it change you? How did it change your beliefs? How did it impact your confidence and your belief in yourself? How did it impact your trust, not only in yourself, but your trust in other people generally and your trust in authority specifically, right? Were there other costs or losses that you had? Did that hurt your career? Did it hurt your pocketbook? Did you have salary implications or bonuses or things like that you didn't get because of what happened, And so just beginning to recognize that, I think is the first part of it. And then as we have acknowledgement of that pain, we also need to receive validation and comfort. And I think that's one of the things that we don't, because we're such a pick yourself up by your bootstraps society, I think we have not done well at learning to receive comfort. And then we move through that process. And at some point you're like, okay, now I need to release this negativity. I can't stay a victim. I need to move through this. And so I need to recognize, did I play any part in this? I need to take ownership of that. If I did, I may need to forgive myself for whatever, role I played in this or whatever I did or didn't do well. anything that might have provoked this, or if the hurtful thing that came my way was because of a failure that was mine. I may need to forgive myself. I may need to forgive someone else. I need to let go of judgments and bitterness and anger and resentment and any other yucky stuff that I just like, this is not going to help me. Sometimes we think it will. We think, well, I've got to protect myself moving forward. And so I'm gonna armor up, and I'm gonna remember what happened last time, right? And then that gets us into what I call powerful decisions, where it's Scarlett O'Hara, as God is my witness, I will never speak up in that meeting again. Yeah. I will never let this happen. I'm never going to let somebody talk to me like this, or I'm never going to share an idea like this, with this kind of group of people or in this context. And so that's where we start creating these unwritten rules that then begin to hold us back. And so we have to re-examine those powerful decisions and say, is that going to serve me well moving forward, right? It might have been the thing that I needed to do to protect myself. And especially if we're talking about leadership injuries that came from childhood that are now showing up in the workplace, because we're playing out patterns with our parents, with our boss now, right? That it happens. It happens. It does. Our early authority figures, those kind of, the schemas that we have around authority and how we relate to people who are in charge, those kinds of things come from an early age. So it could have been a parent, a teacher, a coach, but let's examine how am I showing up in light of that decision? And maybe there was something that I learned from that situation that was actually good, and I do need to carry it forward. But maybe I need to qualify that. Maybe it's not that leaders, plural and globally, cannot be trusted. Maybe it's that particular person I need to be careful with, And so just re-examining, are the conclusions that I've drawn about this situation, about myself, about leaders, are those accurate? And are they going to serve me well? And then as you move through that, you begin to enter into a place where you can redeem your story and start to look for, how is this making me a better, stronger person? Right? All of those years I worked with veterans, and, of course, everybody's now pretty much aware of post-traumatic stress. But to ask about post-traumatic growth, fewer people know that there is there's actually incredible resilience and growth that happens on the other side of trauma and loss, especially when we take the time to examine it and thoughtfully determine how we want to let that shape who we become. And we can leverage that pain of the past and say, okay, so this is what happened to me. Here's who I want to be on the other side of this. Here's who I want to be to overcome this, right? Having the hero mindset versus the victim. And here's who I want to be as a leader, right? Here's how I want to protect other people so they don't have to go through what I did. And this is how it's going to make me better and stronger and help me make a more positive contribution to the people around me.
Wow. Okay, I'm just going to let that sink in for just a second. Yeah, what a journey though. And you bring up such an important point that sometimes, I'm thinking of psychodynamics, sometimes the defense mechanisms that we carry around with us, first of all, they're not serving us anymore. We think they are. We think that the way we armor up and as God is my witness, I'll never be hungry again, that's going to protect us from future harm. But what it's doing instead is preventing us from healing and then eventually that post-traumatic growth.
Right.
So recognizing it in the first place.
We're closing ourselves off from a corrective experience that would say, actually, that was a one-off. That's not how it normally is.
Yeah.
Not everybody's like that, right? Because we've just decided that's a blanket thing. So yeah, sometimes it keeps us from experiencing something new that would redeem that original incident. And by the way, if we've adopted a negative belief about ourselves or other people, we may actually begin attracting the very thing that we're trying to avoid. Right? And you think about it, just from a brain science standpoint, like if we've decided, hey, this is a salient thing that I need to be on the lookout for, then now my reticular activating system is going to work and I'm starting to notice it. Probably not going to notice the counter examples, right? There's going to be a confirmation bias of what I believe and what I've decided about leadership or authority or myself or whatever. I'm going to notice every single incident now that confirms that. And I'm going to begin attracting more of that into my life. What you focus on, you empower. And I'm actually closing myself off from things that would make that better. and create that post-traumatic growth.
Wow. The other thing that really caught my attention in that as well is just the power of someone else acknowledging it. Before I met you and before you gave me this language of leadership injury, I've coached hundreds and hundreds of leaders through my career, and I was coaching a woman recently, and I just simply, she was telling me her story, and I just simply said, wow, you have experienced a work trauma. And just acknowledging that and calling it trauma, calling it something that was wounding, that was so powerful. And when somebody else recognizes that, then that also, there's something powerful in that acknowledgement and that recognition. Is that what you've seen as well?
Absolutely. And that's why we actually create space, right, in this 5-step protocol, the critical leadership injury protocol. Step 2 is to receive validation. And there is something powerful about it. And I feel like there's something, until we receive that, there's a little part of you that still is nursing and rehearsing the thing until you feel heard. Right. And you think about, just take it even out of this context. What happens? Think about couples, right? People get into an argument, and if somebody starts yelling, what they're telling you is, you haven't heard me yet. I don't feel heard. Right. And so until we feel heard, until we feel validated, oftentimes we'll just kind of stay on this narrative, but no, you don't get it, right? I'm thinking about, It's Not About the Nail, right? If you've seen that thing where this woman has this thing stuck in her head, and every time the guy's like, but I think you have a nail, she's just like, but you don't get it, right? And so there's something about when he's like, yeah, that must be really painful. Oh, that just sounds awful. And she's like, yes, right? And there's just something comforting about, oh, you get it. I'm not the only one. Somebody else sees this. And maybe even somebody else sees that this was an injustice, right? I think there's a lot of this that has to do with, I feel I was wronged, or there was an injustice that happened. And I need that to be seen and acknowledged. And by the way, it may have been a real wrong and a real injustice. Sometimes it was perceived. Maybe I didn't have all the information. I know there have been things that at one point when I was at this level and somebody did something here, I was like, oh, that's so wrong. And then I grew and developed, and I'm like, oh, you know what? I bet this is why they did that. Oh, you know what? That was probably the right call, But when I was here, it didn't change the fact that hurt me.
Yeah,
it was harmful to me. It was painful to me, right? And so even to have that perspective acknowledged. It doesn't necessarily mean that the leader did the wrong thing, or that once you got where they are, that you wouldn't do the same thing once you were armed with all of the information and saw all the variables from the vantage point that they had. But in order to heal, it's not always about just kind of explaining all of those different things. Even when that's the case, to say, I'm sorry that hurt you.
Yeah. It comes back to the communication as well, doesn't it? And then
Right. I care about your experience.
Yeah. Just having that human connection. So you bring up such a great point too about leaders and communication. And I'm curious, so what are the positive impacts that a good leader can have in this healing process, and maybe even preventing leadership injuries in the first place?
I think when we have a leader who believes in us, it causes us to see ourselves differently in a good way. Just as when we have a leader who doesn't believe in us and tears us down, it can impact, our self-confidence. And so there's something I've seen where a good leader who speaks into the people under them, who calls out the gold in them, and says, sees who they're going to be in 5 years, and begins relating to them and treating them as though they were that person. There is something where that actually causes us to we live up to, what people believe about us. And there's something really powerful when that happens, because first of all, it has the ability to heal the pain of the past, right? Now there's a different voice. So my past leader told me I was this, this, and this, but my new leader is giving me a new narrative, and I have now an alternate choice to say, oh, you know what, I'm going to believe that about myself. So it can heal that past. But when you talk about prevention, the cool part is it seems to provide a protective buffer moving forward. So if I have had a good leader who has built into me, believed in me, brought out the best in me, I know what's true about me and I know what I'm capable of. And now when I go into a new situation with another leader who doesn't see that or say that, and maybe even says things that are the opposite, I'm like, that's you. I know me. I know I have counter examples from my history to be able to rebuff that attack and say, no, that's not the whole picture. That's not the totality of who I am. Hey, I may need to look and say, did I not communicate something well in the situation, or did I fall short of that person's expectations of me, or are they just having a bad day, or maybe they've got some leadership injuries of their own, and so they're relating to me in an unhealthy way. But there's a protective factor that carries forward. And then, by the way, if I've experienced healthy leadership, the chances of me being a healthy leader also increase, right? And so we can say it in a way, hurt people, but healed people heal people.
Oh, I was thinking the hurt people, but I've never heard the healed people heal people. Oh, that's brilliant.
It's a powerful thing to experience. It's a powerful thing to experience. And there's something really rewarding when you're able to take something that was done for you and pass it on to somebody else. Like, there's not a lot that beats that. Like, I made the world a better place, freely. I've received that, and now I have it to give away.
Yeah. Freely.
And that's how it multiplies.
Wow.
Let's do that.
Let's do that. I'm in.
Let's do that. I'm in. Yes.
Wow. So what advice would you give to employees or individuals who are recovering from leadership injuries? You've been sprinkling it in throughout, but I'm curious if you can, wrap it up for us. What does that look like? What would you tell them?
I would say do the work. And there's kind of two sides of that. One is what we started with, of recognizing the impact, right? Don't sweep this under the rug. If you've been hurt, acknowledge it and unpack it. It may not be pleasant, but it'll serve you well. And being intentional and addressing it on your own terms is going to beat the pants off of letting it stay back there, continuing to hold you back, and then coming up and biting you when you least expect it, right? So address it on your terms. Acknowledge it. And when I say do the work, it's not just to begin the work, it's to move through the work and to move through that process of saying, okay, I have acknowledged it. I have received validation and comfort, and now I'm ready to release the negativity, and now I'm ready to re-examine those powerful decisions, and I'm ready to redeem my story. I'm not going to stay a victim. I'm going to overcome this, and I want to be thinking about, how do I want to come? And then maybe that's a practical thing as you enter into that process is to ask the question, what's the story I want to be able to tell on the other side of this, right? When I am describing what happened to somebody else, it's easy for me to maybe say, well, he or she did this, that, and the other, and this is why it sucked and it was horrible and they were mean to me and blah, 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 and here's all the terrible things that happened. Okay. If you were fully healed, what story would you tell? How do you want to be able to talk about this, who you became because of it, how you lead differently because of what you experienced? Think about that piece of it, and that'll give you a vision for where you want to go, and it becomes the motivation to keep you moving through the process so you don't get stuck in the hard part.
And there's something powerful about being able to visualize the other side. And that what does healed look like?
Right. Yeah. Right. And you may be able to picture what it looks like. You may be able to feel what it looks like. Right. Sometimes it's hard for people to have in their mind's eye maybe a picture of that, but you might be able to feel it and to say, well, if I didn't have this pain, like what would that be? And how would I would feel confident. I would feel safe. I would, I would be able to trust again. And I would say, you know what, I am not going to let this person write my story. I recently heard somebody talking about this in a brilliant way. And And the idea was, hey, there may be bad actors in your story, but they don't have to become authors. Don't give them a pen.
Wow. They don't get to write it.
They don't get to write your story unless you let them. And if you stay stuck, then you've essentially given them the pen to write your story.
And you've given up. You've given up agency.
Right.
Control.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. And to say like, okay, well, so that was a bad scene in my story. They may have been a bad actor, but they're not going to be the author. Like I get to keep writing my story from here. And I get to overcome, and the story does not end with me being a victim. And so if I can begin to visualize that, if I can begin to think about what it would feel like to overcome, if I can begin to think about what you lost and how you do things differently. And if that were reversed, like, oh, I actually do trust people. Oh, I actually, you know what? I empower other people because I know what it feels like to not be empowered, Oh, so I'm really intentional about giving other people what I didn't get. Those kinds of things. Envisioning that, I think is a really powerful way to help you keep moving through because you keep your eye on the goal. You keep your eye on the target.
And it sounds like it's not always a linear process, and it's not always a complete, like it's like, okay, done, check, move it, moving on. That it sounds like it can be iterative.
It sometimes happens in layers. And one of the things that I've discovered with this 5-step process, each one of them maps onto one of the stages of grief.
Oh.
Because when we experience a leadership injury, it's a type of trauma, as you said, right? A workplace trauma, perhaps. And with trauma is loss, and with loss is grief. And so, when we talk about, hey, the very first step is to acknowledge what's happened to you. Well, that's kind of like coming out of denial, which is usually the first stage of grief, right? And allowing yourself to experience the sadness of it, dealing with the anger that is a part of that. And those powerful decisions relate to the coulda, woulda, shouldas, the bargaining of grief. And then that redeeming your story is part of that acceptance of like, hey, it might not have been, my favorite part of the story. I wish I could have fast forwarded or skipped that part altogether. But wow, look what it produced. And I've come to a place where I'm at peace with it. And it doesn't hold me back anymore. And in fact, I've learned a way to leverage it to make me a better leader.
Post-traumatic growth. Yeah.
Yes, that is the goal.
Well, what would you say, and to leaders who through their journey they've realized and come to understand, oh, I'm one of those people who have caused the damage. Because sometimes our growth journey, we realize that we were the person that was causing that harm. What would you say to those leaders?
I would say there's an opportunity to redeem that part of the story by taking ownership and responsibility. And we see this even, if you think about 12 steps in recovery, right? The making amends. And I think sometimes people are afraid of like, oh, well, what are people going to think if I go back, especially if it's not somebody that's currently in my life. This may be somebody that I realize I wronged years ago because I was a new leader. I didn't really know what I was doing. I had a lot of insecurity. And so, but being able to say, you know what, maybe I can track that person down. Certainly if it's somebody that's still under your leadership, to have that conversation and to say, you know what, I realize that probably didn't feel good to you. And I'm sorry, to take ownership. I think, one of the ways that we can prevent leadership injury is by dealing with our own fears and insecurities. Right. And especially if we have been a victim of somebody else's leadership injury, right? Victims become villains oftentimes. And back to the hurt people who hurt people. Right. But to say, okay, but part of my healing is to also be able to go back and say, well, what would I have needed from a leader who had hurt me? And if you feel afraid, think about the respect that you would have for somebody who came back and apologized.
Wow.
Like that person just went from zero to hero. It's like, oh, I have a ton of respect for you now. And so much of the time, I think most of us are willing to give grace to somebody who comes to us and owns their mistakes and says, I blew it. I should not have said that. I should not have done that. Or even if it was one of those things where it was a perception kind of thing, just somebody who says, hey, I did the best I could in that situation. I'm really sorry about how that impacted you. And I recognize that that was not easy for you. It is not what you were hoping for. And that probably felt like an injustice to you. Just somebody to validate, like if you can get that validation from the person who hurt you, imagine how that moves you forward in the healing process.
Oh, but you're right too. And the esteem that I would have for that individual.
It takes guts to go clean up your mess.
That's courageous. Yeah.
It is courageous. And so instead of them being kind of like negative in terms of our emotional bank account, like, oh, the person has made a big withdrawal, like, wow, you just made a huge deposit. And so to not be afraid of doing that and recognize the chances are, like, if I need to do it so that I can be at peace with myself and just know that I've done everything in my power, it's not about whether or not they accept my apology. My job is to offer it. But I feel more courageous to do that when I think about how I would esteem somebody who had the guts to come to me and say, I blew it.
Yeah.
Like, we all make mistakes.
Yeah.
And it's so much easier to forgive people who admit them.
And then we're not carrying those mistakes around with us either. Like,
Right.
and then letting those mistakes write our future story.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Again, whatever you focus on, you empower. So if you're continuing to replay and rehearse, you're going to repeat.
Wow. Dr. April, this has been a fantastic conversation. I have learned so much, and I am positive that it has been deeply valuable to our listeners. But before I let you go, my research assistant, Percy the penguin, he has a few questions for you. Percy, are you there? Thank you, Percy. Okay, Percy's first question is from a previous guest, Shannon Trimmel. And her question is, what is something that you have not done yet that is essentially on your bucket list or that you have plans to do? And why haven't you done it? And what are you going to do to make it happen in the next year or two?
So I have one that's in progress. And that is, I am on a mission to run marathons in all 50 states.
Wow.
So I have 13 down and 37 to go. And I am currently training for my next one, which is it's the Too Slow for Boston Marathon. They actually give prizes to the slowest runners. And so I'll be tackling that one in April. And I think it's going to take me more than a year or two to complete this, but I like dreaming big. And so I'm excited to be on that mission.
Good for you. Well done. I want to know when you've completed that one, and that's off the bucket list. Oh, that's fantastic. Is there anything else, or is that it?
Oh my goodness. I am full of ideas and adventures and things like that. One of the things that I checked off just in the past week, I went and took an aerial arts class. It was like Cirque du Soleil kind of stuff. And I went and took an aerial hammock class. So that was one that I did recently. And there are different things. Some of it is like adventures. I like to travel. I like to try new experiences. And I think there's something, anytime I realize my best reason for not doing something is fear, it's usually something I should probably do. So there's that. But then I think there are other things. One of the things that I have been encouraged to do is to write a book. I have contributed to quite a few. I've written a few forewords. I've contributed a chapter here and there. And that's one of the things that I don't know that I'll write it in the next year or two. I think I value slow productivity and I value quality over quantity or speed. But I am, by continuing my research, I'm taking steps toward being able to hopefully write a quality book on leadership injury. And I have several others that are in here that will come out eventually.
Well, I confess to being among those who have encouraged you to write that book. I'm like, where's your book, April? I need to read this.
Be patient. Stay with me.
I will stay with you. And, I love the slow productivity because there's, the depth and the richness will be so apparent. And I know it's going to be robust and powerful and full of stories.
Thank you. And anybody who needs permission for slow productivity, go read Cal Newport's book of the same name.
Got it.
It's fantastic. He's such an advocate of deep work, right? Which is another one of his books. But just saying, like, by the way, that the quality doesn't happen quickly. Oftentimes, oftentimes it takes time, and it's worth the time we spend. And so I consider his book as like a permission slip to go slow and do it right.
I love it. I think so.
And to savor the experience. I think that's the other thing that I've learned so much. When you go slow, you can savor. And if you think about, dancing, which I do, that's, Argentine tango is one of my passions. Like, the best dances are the slow ones. So it really is about being present and enjoying life, enjoying the process, enjoying the journey. And that makes a huge difference in how we approach life.
I think there's so much there. And with the rise of AI and how quickly can we get things done, this is the opposite of that. This is the rich, deep value of slowness. Gosh,
And this is something we can only experience, I think, as humans. I mean, I guess we used to have slow computers, but
I still do.
but it's not. It doesn't feel like a rich, satisfying experience.
Not at all. It's frustrating. Yeah.
But I think, and especially when you're talking about the kinds of things that we've talked about today, like this process, it can. I'll say this. I've had amazing experiences where I've seen people get breakthrough in a single session and get free of something in a few minutes that they had carried for years. So I will say that it can happen that way. And then I've also noticed, even in doing my own work, there are times where I have to pause and let it breathe. And when I give myself permission to breathe, the defenses come down and you actually move faster. Again, slow is smooth and smooth is fast.
I love that. Well, Dr. April, Percy has another question. He also wants to know, what is one question you would like to ask a future guest?
I think because we were talking about leadership, that's what I'd like to know from a future guest is, what has a leader said or done that brought out the best in you and helped you believe in yourself in a way that you didn't before you encountered them? And then maybe kind of as the follow-up to that, like, and then how do you perpetuate that? How do you bring out the best in others and help them believe in themselves more than they do?
Yeah. Oh, good questions. Dr. April, I hope you come back so that we can have another conversation. And I have so many more questions to ask you, but we're out of time. So thank you for sharing your insights and your wisdom with us today.
It was such a pleasure. I'm so glad that we had this conversation. Thank you for having me.
You bet. Well, how can our listeners find you and learn more about your work and your research?
I appreciate you asking. The easiest way to find me is to go to draprilspeaks.com. And there they'll be able to connect with me and learn a little bit about the Leadership Injury Project. The best thing to do with that would be to simply reach out to me, send me an email, and we'll go from there. But the Leadership Injury Project is something that I'm happy to share with your listeners. And it is a research endeavor to study leadership injury in a qualitative kind of way. And the way it works is we have these one-on-one conversations. So when somebody enters the project, they sit down and we do a 90-minute Zoom session, and that gives people a chance to tell their story. We talk about that 5-step healing process. And if it's something where they have been hurt by a leader, right, they get to kind of evaluate, like, oh, well, what steps have I taken? Are there some that I still need to take, and assess that? But the other thing that I do in that consultation is it's an opportunity. If you're leading a team and you recognize, oh, I've got somebody on my team that's being impaired by a leadership injury, right? Again, I'm having to fix what I didn't break here. but this is somebody on my team that is hurting because of something that's happened, and now it's impacting their work, it's impacting the team, and I want to know how to help them, how I can lead them. Then we can talk about that too. So it's really an opportunity to tell your story and essentially receive a free consultation. And my aim is that those would be healing conversations, but then cumulatively would contribute to our understanding of leadership injuries and how to heal and prevent them.
So Leadership Injury Project, and they can reach you at draprilspeaks.com. And we will list that in the episode notes as well. April, thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us in this conversation. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone who could use a dose of inspiration and creativity and leadership growth. And please leave us a review. We read every single one. So until next time, keep saying I'm in to creativity, bold thinking, transformational growth, and meaningful conversations. May you be wildly creative in your life and leadership. I'll see you soon.